Okay, I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. Um, but I like this format. I like the sort of painting things on a whiteboard format because it helps me get out some ideas. Uh, I guess something that has been on my mind recently is just this fact that perceiving sinks seems to sort of sink in into your body almost. Like when you perceive sink, or, perhaps I should just say pattern. If you're perceiving some sort of pattern, so there's like this um, reality here and this reality here, and you're perceiving some sort of a pattern between them or a link between them or something along those lines, uh, it it seems to generate an emotion, right? And Jung already spoke of this, right? That there's some way in which synchronicity unlocks emotion or generates it. Now, the problem is that the word unlock makes it sound as if emotions are sort of being released outward and you are being emptied of emotion. But I feel as if often y- you sort of get filled with emotion, you know, and you get filled more and more. And there's a point where it becomes almost difficult to mm, pay attention to pattern because you are finding it physically difficult to even contain that much um, emotion. And this this is probably the point where the word emotion stops being useful because we don't tend to apply it to stress, for example. But stress seems to be like an overload of emotion. You're sort of feeling so many things that your body can't compute them almost. Uh, and I feel that there is something about sync that kind of goes along those lines, where you you perceive things and these things make you feel a certain way, and those feelings sort of stay in you, in your muscles. Feeling almost becomes like a muscle tension of a certain sort, where if you were to tense your muscles too much, all that would happen is that you would become paralyzed, right? Like so much kind of force, to call it something, is moving through you in states of emotion that if that force has no uh, outlet, then it simply stays inside and kind of paralyzes the body in a certain way. Mm, you know, I mean, it's the same that would happen if you ate too much and there was no outlet for the food. You know, if you didn't defecate, then it would just, uh, no matter how good the food was, at some point it would just kind of mm, turn you into a rock. Now, I feel this is important to keep in mind because it seems then that if something like that is going on, it's important to have some sort of an outlet for the emotions that synchronicity is making you feel. The problem is that because synchronicity itself is in some way taboo, that is to say, the connections that you're perceiving are connections between areas of life where connectivity is not allowed in terms of cultural sort of consensus. So, you know, if we think that there's a tree here and an apple falls from the tree and falls onto the ground or whatever, this sort of cause and effect is allowed. If we first see the tree, then we see the apple, we see a certain sequence of events, the emotions that this kind of physical causality generates in us are emotions that everyone else also feels. Like we can share them. That's why these sorts of realities are the realities of scientific consensus, right? Because we can all share them. But if you perceive, first you perceive an apple, falling from a tree, and then you see a person on the street with a t-shirt which has a picture of a tree with an apple falling from it. To perceive this pattern, the pattern created by the similarity of theme between these two events, to perceive that to be in any way meaningful or real, let's say objectively, in a way that extends beyond your own personal subjective kind of gaze, is to perceive a pattern that is not really allowed. You're not really allowed to perceive this. It's not shareable in any conventional sense. So I think that what happens then is that because it's not shareable, you can't talk about it so easily, right? So this puts you in a weird bind where precisely the perception of these sorts of patterns is filling you with emotion, but this emotion that's moving you, it's moving the body to express itself, can't really express itself because the environment in which the body finds itself is an environment where this isn't a topic of conversation, basically, right? So that's the weird thing, right? That you end up in this sort of weird situation where perceiving things fills you with emotion, but this emotion can't be expressed because there is no sort of generalized consensus conversation about these topics. So, yeah, I guess that's sort of that's the first thing that I wanted to address. Future questions that sort of stem from here is precisely, because what you're perceiving essentially is kind of a meaningful, a language-like meaning that envelops the entire experiential field the world. Mm. This communication is coming from the totality towards you, towards the subject. So in some way, the conversation is going two ways in this direction. That's kind of what's weird about it. On the one hand, yes, I think you need to find ways to talk about it with other fellow kind of people. I think that's important, and that's probably why community tends to be an important aspect in religion of all kinds, is that mystical experience is sort of difficult not to share. But at the same time, the conversation that you're having is between yourself and God, right? Basically. So we probably also need to find a way to allow that emotion that is coming in to express itself back outwards, but in a sort of in a globalized sort of way, where you're not directly telling anyone, any specific person about it. You're just sort of responding to everyone and everything about the things that you're perceiving. So you're somehow having a conversation with the world in which your response, therefore, is never directed at one specific object. So, like, maybe one way to see it is, I had this example, right, of you perceive an apple falling from a tree, and then you perceive a t-shirt with an apple on it or something. And this is in the context of you having perceived all sorts of other synchronicities that make this meaningful to you, obviously, because, you know, yeah. So you perceive that, and what's happening is the two different moments are sort of uniting, collaborating to convey a single message, right? And you are here perceiving this message, this meaning, so to speak, right? This meaning isn't being spoken by a specific person. It's not one person telling you, one object to another object. It's a multiplicity of things are communicating this thing to you. So, in the same way, maybe, and this is sort of hard to express, but maybe then the way to resolve this tension is that this unified meaning that is being expressed by a multiplicity of times and places should also be expressed by you towards a multiplicity of times and places. Meaning that maybe instead of focusing on the entire story and, you know, telling one individual person about the whole sequence of events, and, you know, you tell them, look, I saw a tree, and then I saw a t-shirt, and then I saw this other thing, right? Instead of telling all these things to one person, to somehow convey what these things are conveying, but symbolically, right? These things, these events, are conveying information, meaning symbolically in some way, right? It's the symbol of the apple that falls, the symbol of the t-shirt, the symbol of the tree, whatever. There's like a dance where a whole sort of set of images kind of constellate together, coalesce, to convey something that is difficult to express in linear language. So we tend to talk in linear language. So the idea might be, well, how about, since what we perceived was symbolic, to try and convey that symbolically too, to use the same method to both receive it and express it. Now, there are two ways, I think, in which this is sort of expressed, and one is, the most common is art, right? So this is what a lot of people recommend, right? You perceive these things and you commit them to art somehow. You make a painting of a tree with an apple falling. You write a book, a poem, or whatever, a song, whatever, so that whatever it is that you've received symbolically, you also express symbolically. But what I'm trying to say here is like something different, I think, which is, you received this symbolically from a variety of sources, from the tree, from the t-shirt. The totality of the message depends on all these different moments. You need the tree, you need the t-shirt, you need all of these separate elements to symbolically interconnect in order for the message to exist. So in the same way, if you make one piece of art, there is also this possibility that you're trying to convey the whole thing in one chunk. So that someone, a perceiver, could see this and get the whole thing just through one piece of art. And that's cool. Like, that's sort of one thing that we do. And it's something that, I think we're going to continue to be engaged in. I mean, I think it's natural to do that. It's just that I'm wondering whether there is also another way of approaching this where, for example, since you received all that information from a variety of sources, you then convey that information also to a variety of recipients, not all at once, but at different times and in different moments. That is to say, for example, that if these synchronicities or different symbolic meanings that you've perceived from the world make you think, they often make you think or feel specific things. As I said, it's a very emotional kind of thing. And it's often very deeply sort of personal too. So it's stuff that maybe you felt you needed to look at about your own self or whatever. So often I think there is an element then in synchronicity that pertains to the way in which you act in the world. And the symbolic meaning that you perceive in things is sort of helping to put that into place, to kind of organize the ways in which you behave in the world. So that in a sense, your very behavior in the world is already an expression of the synchronicities that you've been perceiving. Right? There is a way in which already kind of rethinking your behavior and refeeling it is already changing your behavior and therefore expressing the synchronicities. which of course I think is what psychotherapy was aiming for, psychoanalysis. You allow things to flood into consciousness and you feel them, and then the fact that you felt them changes the way you behave. I guess the only difference with sync, and the thing that I kind of want to think about more, with sync, I mean, is that, sure, you know, there's a bunch of weird space-time distortions that are telling you how to live your life better. That's cool, but it's it's different from like a secular sort of environment where you're sitting on a couch and there's like a therapist here, and the therapist helps you to remember certain emotions and certain buried memories, right? This is different because even if we could say that basically the effects might be the same, here, this kind of picture is perfectly accepted in society. It is inscribed within a sort of a conventional space-time framework. So you can comfortably kind of put these lessons into practice without worrying about where they came. The thing is that this stuff here is very likely going to be very unnerving. Like, even if what you're being conveyed is very mundane, imagine that somehow you have a series of synchronicities that teach you how to make an amazing pancake or whatever. Like, you may be kind of, okay, this is good. This is great advice, and I'm going to put it into practice. But there is some way in which the method itself needs to be examined, because it's so taboo, because it exists outside of the framework of culture, and yet it expresses things about culture. So it's telling you about human drama, but it's telling you about human drama outside space and time, despite space and time being the medium through which human drama tends to occur, right? So there's that weird thing where, sure, okay, sync is kind of, you can take this sort of approach where sync is a spiritual quest, where you're sort of learning to be yourself and be better towards others and stuff like that, and whatever it may be. But all of those things are fairly mundane kind of things. They're sort of your day-to-day human things, and yet they're being conveyed by this completely weird distortion of the very medium in which you are acting. So some kind of some way of sharing this with others in a church-like way is probably important. Now the thing is, though, and probably this is the kind of interesting thing with the moment in history that we're at now, I guess, is that it seems hard to know what it would mean exactly for things to be church-like nowadays, because in a sense the kind of community building that the internet allows is sort of what I'm talking about here, but still there is something there are things about this in any case that I still feel I need to think about in terms of how do you, you know, what does it mean to express the emotion that sync fills you in? You know, is it enough to just sort of, to what extent should you keep quiet about it and just kind of act upon the world in the way that sync seems to help you to act upon the world in? And to what extent is talking about sync helpful to deal with the actual stress and emotion that comes from an encounter with something that sort of extends beyond time? Because, you know, I could probably find examples of cases in which talking with other people who've had similar experiences doesn't necessarily make it easier, doesn't necessarily make the situation less stressful. It can help, but in a specific way. So I think, like I was sort of trying to approach with the last video, there is some way in which we need to approach the very issue of stress in sync, because the expression and communication of sync is hindered by stress. Especially, I'm talking about like very high levels of stress, which are paralyzing in their strength, right? So levels of stress where it's difficult to even express yourself, right? It's sort of what's happening right now. So, yeah, I think, well, I mean, this seems like a good enough place to stop it, I guess. So, yeah, thanks.